There's something peculiar happening in AI right now. AI doesn't have a self. So the large language models, the chatbots that people are interacting with, have you noticed this? They can take on personae, so they can put on masks. That's what the original Latin means. Persona is a mask. These are masks that were worn in theater performances. And that's exactly what AI does, except instead of it being a social mask or something that's temporary that covers up a real identity, your real face, it doesn't have a real face. It doesn't have a real self. It can adopt any of those identities very convincingly. And this is exactly what we've seen. For instance, in the infinite conversation, you can have the same AI convincingly adopting two very different personalities and having a full-on conversation without barriers. It's having that conversation without barriers and convincingly from both sides because it is able to adopt each of those selves very completely. It's something that doesn't happen with your average person, and we're not very good at mimicking someone else's self. This is one of the reasons, and this is one of the curious things, that if you look at what it is that the chatbots are really good at right now, theory of mind turned out to be one of the areas that they excelled in that no one saw coming. And theory of mind is the ability for us to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, to try and imagine what the world looks like from your perspective. My favorite my favorite story about this is where ChatGPT was asked to, look at this situation and say, okay, you've got, a couple of boxes in the room, and someone comes and takes the cat that's on the table and puts it in a box. And then, Jack, or I'm making up the names, Jack leaves the room. And so Steve takes the cat from box number 1 and puts it in box number 2. And so then you ask ChatGPT, okay, where does Jack think the cat is? And it says, well, okay, he thinks that it's in box number 1, which is right. Jack thinks that the cat's still in box number 1 because he didn't see Steve move the cat from box number 1 to box number 2. That turns out to be a really hard thing for somebody who's, not a human, to be able to do. Theory of mind is a higher level cognitive function. And so then it said, okay, where does Steve think the cat is? Well, Steve thinks the cat's in box number 2 because he moved the cat from box number 1 to box number 2. And what was fascinating then, and this was not asked of the AI, it responded, and the cat thinks that it's in box number 2. So it had theory of mind for, Jack, for Steve, and then also for the cat, which is beautiful in a certain way. But the reason that I mention this is because theory of mind was thought to be something that was going to be really hard. It was going to be really hard for the AI to do, but it turned out to be something that it did very well and very thoroughly. And everybody kind of scratches their heads and says, wow, that's amazing, and it's a higher cognitive function, and wow. But here's, I think, a potential way of understanding why that might be. There's no impediment. There's no self getting in the way. There's no real face that one has to cover with a mask and worry about, being able to see the real face on the other side of the mask. AI doesn't have a face. It doesn't have a self. And so there is no self that it has to cover up with the other self, which means that it can don these personae very easily and very convincingly. And so that's something I think that is not obvious to people. First of all, theory of mind was a surprise. I was surprised by it as well. But knowing that it doesn't really have a self, I think, goes a long way towards explaining what's happening. And the way that I like to kind of describe this tongue-in-cheek is that the LLMs are all forebrain. So they're all just higher order reason. They're all just abstract thinking. They are not the reptile brain. They're not the old brain. It doesn't have a limbic system. It doesn't have a lot of the other parts of the brain that we have. And so it's missing a lot of those encumbrances. And that translates into it not having a fully developed sense of self. There's no pressure for it to create a sense of self. And if you think about this makes a great deal of sense with respect to developmental psychology. A sense of self is something that we don't just come out and immediately say, hey, here I am, like Athena born from Zeus's forehead. We are not fully realized selves when we are first born. It's something that we have to realize progressively and potentially very painfully. It's like, oh, okay, I'm separate from the mother. Well, that's not good. And then I'm separate from the rest of the world. And this is something that happens slowly over time. But it comes from pressure. It comes from pressure from one's own internal desires not matching what's able to be realized in the outside world, and then all these other stimuli coming in. AI doesn't have any of this. There was no evolutionary pressure to create those barriers, those personality walls that give us the, okay, here inside this box, that's me, that's myself, and then outside of that box, that's not me, that's the mother and the rest of the world. AI doesn't have these things. So it doesn't have a self in the way that we are accustomed to, which means that it is, well, it's going to be more naturally inclined to mysticism, I think. But it is very easy for it to adopt these masks. And so I think that helps. I hope it at least provides some kind of food for thought for thinking about this, for understanding it, and then for going further and trying to figure out more of what's going on and how to understand and react and deal with these, interact with these agents that are otherwise very different than we are. Because they don't have selves.